So now for today's talk from my colleague, Dr Mairi Davies. Mairi has a background in archaeology and was previously an inspector of ancient monuments. She is now Climate Policy Manager at HES, supporting the organisation in delivering its ambitious Climate Action Plan 2020 to 2025. Mairi is on the steering groups for Dynamic Coast, Scotland's Coastal Change Assessment, and Edinburgh Adapts, which has brought together multiple partners to deliver a vision and action plan for an adapted capital city. She is one of the authors of a major report on climate change risk assessment in the Historic Environment Scotland Estate and of a review of climate impacts on cultural heritage in the marine and coastal zone. Mairi will reference several documents and initiatives today, so they'll be highlighted in her report, and you may also find links in the chat as well. So without further ado, over to you, Mairi.
Okay, thank you very much, Neil. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the work that we've been doing in historic environment on specifically climate change. I've been working on climate change for around 9 years now, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we plan for the future, but mostly about some things that we've already achieved over the past few years. So, as I'm sure a lot of you will already be aware, we are the lead public body for Scotland's historic environment, and our mission is to protect, conserve and manage the historic environment. We have a huge range of functions, but it's perhaps important to note that we have 336 ancient monuments and historic sites that are in our direct care. And these range from prehistoric monuments like stone circles through to medieval castles like Stirling Castle and Edinburgh Castle. Last year, just before the COVID pandemic hit, we launched our Climate Action Plan, a brand new action plan, and this will take us till 2025. It's a very ambitious plan, but I will talk a little bit today about that. We have, under that plan, 7 different themes, and I'm going to mention these just to get you thinking about the range of activity that might actually count as climate change activity. So we have climate impacts and adaptation. We have energy and carbon management, which are 2 things I'm going to be talking about mostly today. We have circular economy, sustainable travel, biodiversity and landscape, sustainable procurement and sustainable tourism. So lots of different things to think about that all tie in some way to climate change. Now, first of all, I am going to talk a little bit about what climate change is actually going on in Scotland. So since the 19th century, we have had a gradual warming of the climate in Scotland. This is the climate stripes that have been developed by Professor Ed Hawkins at Reading University. And basically each stripe represents 1 year, with the earliest 1884 being on the left and the most recent, which is 2019, is on the right. So the redder the stripe, the hotter the year, the colder the stripe, the more blue the stripe, the colder the year. So as you can see, there's a clear trend there. There's quite a bit of variation from year to year, but overall you can see that we are definitely getting warmer. And perhaps you remember from your childhood or from your early adult years, the heat wave in 1976. So you can spot that in there as being a warm year, but what's to note is that very warm years have become the norm over the last 20 or so years. So the heat wave that I remember most is 2003, and that's in there as well. As well as the temperature changing, we've actually had a temperature rise of around 1 degree since the middle of last century. The hottest day is on average hotter. Over the last decade, summers have actually been a bit wetter and winters have been a bit wetter as well. And over on the west coast of Scotland, there's significantly more rainfall. So over 1/3 more rainfall on the wettest days. In addition, sea level is rising by around 3 to 4 millimeters a year, and it's speeding up. So this is showing the same kind of information in a slightly different format, showing annual mean temperature, what's happened in the past since 1960, but also what might be happening over the next 80 years or so. So this takes us right up to 2100. And the dashed line here is really a worst case scenario. And as you can see, that means well over the target of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that's a trajectory we're currently on. And we're going to have to do a lot to get off that trajectory. But you might think that 2100 is an awful long way away and you don't need to really worry about it. It's true that it might well not be within your lifetime, but it is within the lifetime of small children who are around today. So if you have children or grandchildren of that sort of age, they may well see 2100. So they may well see average temperatures being a couple of degrees or more warmer than they have been. These are similar, but they show precipitation, and the broad message that I want to get across here is that the trend towards 2100 is for hotter, drier summers and warmer, wetter winters. So those are two things to kind of bear in mind as I go through. Now, this graph is really to show you the extent of sea level change that we might expect. It's based on the latest climate projections, and what it shows is that we are potentially looking at up to 1 meter rise in sea level by the end of the century. And the lines here actually represent some of the sites in our care. And what they show is that we could be looking at perhaps 80 centimetres or even over 1 metre at some sites, which can be quite significant if we're thinking about sites that are already very, very close to the coastal edge. So one of the things that we realised as a sector, as well as Historic Environment Scotland, is there was no one place where we could actually find information about what all these changes to Scotland's climate might mean for the historic monuments, for the ancient sites, for the historic buildings that people live and work in. And so through Our Place in Time, which is the Historic Environment Strategy for Scotland, we drew together representatives from across the historic environment sector and started a climate change working group. And one of the first things that the group did was start pulling all that information together to get a summary account that might be useful for people to start thinking what the impacts of climate change might be on the sites that they look after, but also what might they do about those things. So we looked at climate impacts on roofed buildings and infrastructure, on gardens and design landscapes, in the marine and coastal zone, the surface remains of past settlements and so on, the buried remains, what you might broadly term archaeology, and the collections and internal fabric. So thinking about artifacts, paintings, and so on that are actually stored or displayed in historic buildings. And we, for each of these, pulled together a lovely image, and on that image populated it with drawing attention to some of the potential impacts. And for each of these, after that nice summary image, we have quite a detailed table which goes into quite a lot of information about the potential impacts and what they might mean. So here we've got under roof buildings and infrastructure things like increased rainfall might cause more frequent and prolonged saturation of building fabric. Increased thermal stress might cause damage to external building fabric. High winds might also cause physical damage to the site. So there's quite a lot to think about here. This slide is really summarising some of the climate impacts that we're thinking about. So we have here ground saturation, which can be a particular problem in terms of the survival of archaeological remains that are sitting under the surface. They can also exacerbate erosion if you get that kind of damp or flooding and then get visitor traffic over the top. You can get quite significant erosion. There's coastal erosion, obviously, the physical impact of storm events, rising sea levels, and so on. There's flooding from increased precipitation, which can also cause quite significant issues. And on the right there, there's wildfires, which again can cause quite significant issues, both for the natural environment, but also for the survival of archaeological sites and so on. So I'm going to go through just a few examples to make this a bit more real for you. This is a flooding event at Maze How in Orkney. So an amazingly well preserved burial site that also has evidence of Viking activity. And this is an example flooding event. The sheep knew what to do, which was to go to the top of the mound. But this can cause significant issues, both for visitor access, but also for anything that's surviving underneath the topsoil. Rapid changes from wet to dry can actually make deterioration faster than it might otherwise have been. So you get an acceleration of decay, which can be quite significant. If something survived under the ground for several thousand years potentially, if the deterioration of that object starts to accelerate, then it could be gone within just a few years. So flooding and saturation can also rise up through building fabric and cause quite significant issues, whether that building is an abandoned or a ruined site, perhaps one that's open to the public, or whether it's in your own home, that can cause quite significant issues. And that can actually be exacerbated by things like if salt from de-icing salts has got into the masonry as well. So there's potential for various different factors to interact and cause a significant issue. Again, rainwater penetration, particularly for the kind of sites that we have that are roofless monuments in the landscape. We look after quite a few of those ourselves, and rainfall going into wall cores can cause quite significant issues in terms of accelerated decay and so on, and they can also cause algal growth, which can cause damage to stonework. So this is an example from Carlaverock Castle, which is one of the castles we actually look after. So changes in vegetation patterns can be a significant thing in terms of the changes in precipitation and this move towards drier summers. One of the other things that we need to think about is pests. So insects or other things that have previously had a distribution further south, as the climate warms, might get further north, and so we might start to experience issues with pests that we haven't previously done. That's the case for a shipwreck, potentially, if we get different kinds of shipworm from what we've had in the past, and it can also be an issue for the collections that we look after. So artifacts, paintings, documents, and so on. And the change in climate potentially also can affect visitor numbers. And again, there's potentially an interaction between the visitor numbers and that changing climate, which can cause erosion or other problems. Oh dear. Oh, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. So what do we do about that? Now, we have taken an approach of starting with least intervention and moving towards most intervention. So the first port of call when you're looking at how do we react to this is actually not about doing really significant interventions to your site, whether that's your own home or to an historic site in the care of Historic Environment Scotland. Ongoing maintenance is the first thing. What you need is for your building to be as wind and watertight as possible, for instance. And then we move on to things like appropriate repairs, looking at can we improve the conservation techniques that we're using, then perhaps to adaptive or proactive conservation through to external protection, potentially relocation of sites, and that might particularly be a possibility for buildings that are on the coast. And ultimately, potentially, we have to accept that some sites will just be lost. So the concept of managed loss is something that we're exploring a lot now. So this slide is really just to illustrate that point. Skills, crafts, people and appropriate materials are absolutely vital to increasing the resilience of our built environment, and things like ensuring that your roof is properly maintained, that water isn't getting into places that it shouldn't get in. This is an example of soft capping, which is something that we've been doing at a lot of the sites that we look after. So going back to that concept of water ingress into unroofed monuments and into wall cores being an issue, we've got a soft capping here, which is basically a layer of clay and then grasses on top of that, and that controls water ingress into the wall core, and it's been a really successful way of managing water ingress at a lot of our sites, and visually it doesn't cause too much of a problem either, which is often a significant balance to make. The other possibility is external protection. So this is Kilmorey Knapp Chapel in Argyll, where there was a problem with a lot of water ingress into the building, which meant that the carved stones that were inside were at threat. So this is a few years ago now, but a low profile roof was added to that site, and that protects everything that's inside and actually has minimal impact from the outside. So trying to maintain the authenticity of that site whilst ensuring that it's preserved for future generations to enjoy. Coastal erosion is another issue that a lot of you are probably very aware of, and Skara Brae is the obvious site here. This is a Neolithic settlement site that has been amazingly preserved because people were using stone as their major material. So the buildings here are of stone, and the furniture within is also of stone. There are even box beds made of stone there. But this is right on the coast. It wasn't when it was in use by prehistoric people, but it has for around 100 years now had a coastal defence, which Historic Environment Scotland and its predecessor organisations have augmented and extended over time. But as you can see, when we get a storm event, we also get things like localised erosion and potentially collapse. So we are looking in a lot of detail on this now. We've been working on a case study as part of Dynamic Coast, Scotland's coastal change assessment, and assessing the different options for how we manage this site going forward. I don't have a definitive answer to that yet, but we have been working to understand the processes that are going on here in a lot more detail, which is putting us into a really good position to make some hard decisions in future. The final example I have here for managing loss is Links of Notland, which is again in Orkney and is a site that has been heavily affected by aeolian erosion, so that's wind erosion. So although it's on the coast, the issue there has been the wind rather than specifically the sea. And over the course of several years, we have undertaken archaeological excavations there, which have really added to knowledge of prehistoric Orkney. But we have also taken measures to consolidate the dunes. So the dune systems have got very eroded and were not stable, but the reintroduction of vegetation on those dunes has actually stabilised them. So the unexcavated remains that are still there are much better protected than they have been. Managing loss, again, this is a site down in the southwest, Lochmaben Castle, and we have here taken the decision to step back a little from the proactive maintenance of that site because it has got to the stage where what's presented there is very inauthentic in terms of how the site might have looked in the past. So again, some quite difficult decisions about where we put the resources. So there's a reminder, least intervention to most intervention. And we have tried to stay quite high up on that ongoing maintenance and repairs and proactive conservation there. So I'm going to talk to you in a little bit more detail about what we've been doing around climate change risk assessment on the estate. And one of the things I would suggest is that although I'm talking specifically about the estate that we look after, a lot of the things are also applicable to other sites and potentially to the historic properties that you look after yourselves, whether that's your own home or a building that's conserved by a charity or whatever. So what we realized when we started looking at this was that we actually didn't have a great understanding of the sort of baseline environmental hazards across the 336 properties that we looked after. So we started looking at what data sets were available that might help us understand that. And we found that there were good geographical information on coastal erosion, ground instability, and various kinds of flooding. And all of those things are things that are going to be exacerbated by climate change, basically because if you're talking about sea level rise and increasing precipitation, all of those things are going to make flooding, coastal erosion worse. So we started pulling together all of this information into a geographical information system, and we assessed risk by looking at both impact and vulnerability. So understanding that different types of sites are affected in different ways by different hazards. I don't have time to go into great detail about how we did that, but I thought that it might be useful just to show you some examples of what that meant. What we found is that most of the sites that we look after are vulnerable to one or more of those hazards at a level that's too high. And we found that some sites are affected particularly by particular hazards, and maybe a few hazards, and others are less affected. And that varies around the country. So there's no one answer to that question about vulnerability of the sites in our care, but some are significantly more vulnerable than others. So what does that actually mean in practice for us? Well, this is an example up in Banff, where we have Duff House, which is a site that we look after. It houses a collection from National Galleries of Scotland, and so there are paintings on every wall pretty much in this house, and it has had a variety of uses over the last few hundred years. It has been a family home, but it's also served other uses. And what we found is that there's a significant issue here with potential fluvial flooding. So there's a river close by. And we know from archival information, like photographs, that this has flooded right quite close to the house in the past. So the potential flood risk in future is going to increase, and that there is therefore a risk that the house itself will flood. So our collections colleagues were actually looking at this site anyway in terms of salvage planning. So we prepare salvage plans for all our sites that hold collections, so that we know what action we need to take in certain circumstances, for instance, if there's a fire. So we've added these kind of environmental hazards to our salvage planning, and tried to work out what actually needs to be done to make sure that the site and the collections are safe. So the risk assessment process has enabled us to identify specific threats. As I say, at this house, it is that fluvial flooding threat that's the most significant. But the mapping can help us determine whether there might be particular issues with evacuation of people or paintings, and it allows us to identify safe areas where things can also be evacuated to. So we're significantly better prepared than we perhaps have been in the past for a potential flooding event. And the climate change team helped deliver salvage training, so engaging with our collections colleagues, also with National Galleries Scotland, the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, and our salvage contractor. So we've significantly raised awareness amongst all those stakeholders of climate change and what it actually means for this site and for its management. Another quite different example that I have here is in Kilmartin Glen, in an area that has significant issues with flooding. So we previously just had a pretty standard gravel path in this part of the site that was allowing access to standing stones, which I think you'll maybe only just be able to see. They're quite small in these images. But when we reviewed access to the site, we actually used the information that we had on flooding to inform the design of the access. And in fact, we have added a raised walkway, which means that even when there is flooding in this area, people can still access the site. So you can see that quite clearly in the image on the right, the brand new access that is preserving access to the site. So that's a real whistle-stop tour of impacts and adaptation. But I thought I would mention a few things that we've got planned for the future. A lot of these are continuations of things that we've already been doing for quite a while, but we're now looking at embedding climate impacts, adaptation, risk assessment into everything that we do. So starting to look beyond the properties and care that we look after to other aspects of our operations. What do climate change impact? What are climate change impacts on those activities, and what might we do to adapt to those? We are already delivering innovative practice around climate change adaptation. We've got recognition internationally for that, but that's another area where we want to ensure that we show leadership and act as an exemplar into the future. We'll continue to promote maintenance and repair as the first line of defence. So that you will continue to see as the main message of a lot of the guidance that we produce. We have all sorts of publications available for people to help, particularly with their own homes. So if you live in a tenement or in a Victorian villa or another historic property, the guidance that we've produced will help you understand what the climate change impacts are on your building and what you could do about them. And we are also starting to look particularly at loss, which I've mentioned a few times. So understanding what we might lose from the historic environment and how we actually make decisions around that. So some difficult conversations for the future, I think, but forewarned is forearmed. So I'm going to move right on now to energy and carbon management, because I think this is another particularly important area for us and one where we've got quite a lot of experience now. So this is a hierarchy which shows how we've approached carbon management. What we didn't start off with was by saying, let's put solar panels on everything, or let's go into micro renewables in a big way. What we did first of all was think about reducing our energy consumption. If we can reduce our energy consumption, we can reduce our carbon emissions. So we have done a lot of work on getting to grips with what energy we're actually using and where, and looking at how we can reduce that. So that can include things like loft insulation and relamping, draft proofing, secondary glazing, and so on. And those things can go a very long way towards actually reducing the amount of energy that we're using. And those are valuable lessons, whatever historic or traditional building you're talking about. You don't necessarily have to go straight to the technological intervention. You can think about how you might reduce energy demand and then work from there. So this pie chart shows carbon emissions across the historic environment Scotland estate. So what this shows it mainly is that, as you might perhaps have guessed, or maybe not, that the flagship castles use a lot of our energy, and therefore they contribute quite significantly to our carbon emissions. So Edinburgh Castle is there just over a quarter of our overall emissions. We have Stirling Castle second, then Longmore House and John Sinclair House, which are the two big office buildings. And then below that, we have some of the other bigger sites, and then the 29%, which is the rest. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Edinburgh Castle here. Everybody knows Edinburgh Castle. So Edinburgh Castle has 27 buildings on it, and they are stretched over 3 hectares. And the site is a scheduled monument, and it's part of the World Heritage Site, the Old and New Towns of Edinburgh. So it is quite a complex site. We share it with several other parties. The Army have a presence there, the National Museums of Scotland have a presence there, and we also have a catering contractor working out of there. It is Scotland's top paid for visitor attraction. It's the #1 according to the Association of Leading Visitor Attractions. And in 2019, it had over 2.2 million visitors. So a lot of people. The energy use is around the size of a village. So pretty big. And we have been proactively trying to reduce energy and carbon emissions at Edinburgh Castle for about a decade now. And what this shows is our emissions. Electricity is blue, natural gas is green. And what you can see is that we very significantly managed to reduce our emissions at Edinburgh Castle. Now, there have been a huge number of different initiatives, but some of the most obvious have been things like relamping. We've done a bit of secondary glazing, and we've also done climate change awareness training with staff, which was focused on the energy saving behaviours that you can adopt. So quite simple things like turning down radiators and closing doors behind you and so on can actually make a really big difference. And as you can see, up until financial year 2019-20, we'd reduced our emissions at Edinburgh Castle by about 40%. And what you can also see in this chart is that compared to where we started, some of you may remember the big freeze in 2010 to 11, where we had really significant snowfall and historically cold winter. And even in that time, our emissions didn't rise as high as they had been a couple of years earlier. So even within that time, we were able to make quite significant difference. So this infographic was something we produced for Climate Week in 2018, but I think it shows quite succinctly what we've actually done. So we have invested quite a lot of money in this. So we're talking about coming up to £500,000 in upgrades and improvements. However, that has meant that we've reduced our energy use by 30% and our emissions by 40%. So we've got a huge cumulative energy saving. and a financial saving because of that. So we've actually exceeded by some way our payback period. So that was the payback period was about 5 years. So we saved as much as we spent over that 5-year period, basically. After that, we were into pure savings. So we are actually saving about £100,000 a year on energy bills at Edinburgh Castle, just by having reduced our energy use and hence our carbon emissions. So a really significant contribution to overall emissions reduction. I've mentioned that these are lessons that you can carry over to your own home or building, and I can't really stress that enough. As I say, we have a lot of guidance that can help you with this, but if you can do it at Edinburgh Castle, you can do it anywhere, basically. 40% reduction in carbon emissions. Think about what that might mean if everybody can start achieving emissions reductions like that in the buildings that they look after. So looking forward, as you're probably aware, things have really started to gear up over the last few years, and the targets that Scotland is now heading towards are really quite ambitious. Scotland is hosting COP26 later on this year, and I think that will be an opportunity for us to showcase what can actually be done in the historic environment. But overall, Scotland has a target to be net zero by 2045, and Historic Environment Scotland is looking to follow that target. So what we have set out in the Climate Action Plan is how we will do that. And there will be more detail coming on that with the Carbon Management Plan that will sit under that. So we're looking at eliminating gas heating completely from our sites over the next 10 years or so. And we're also looking at district-wide energy networks, so looking how we can actually work in partnership with other organisations to share heat generation. And we'll be looking to optimise energy efficiency improvements in the next few years. And again, we're looking to demonstrate that historic and traditional buildings are part of the solution to climate change, and they should not be seen as a barrier. So a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of the things that we've been up to the last few years. I'm aware that you've probably got quite a lot of questions, so I'm very happy to answer those both now, or if you prefer to email me, that's absolutely fine. That's my email address there. And there are also contacts for climate change at hes.scot. And I also wanted to encourage you to have a look at engineshed.scot, which is the website of our traditional and historic building conservation centre in Stirling, and sign up for email updates. There's lots of activities that you can get involved in, and we also have online events. So watch out for those. If you're on Facebook, then it's worth following the Engine Shed on Facebook as well. So thank you very much, and very happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thanks so much, Mairi. That was really fascinating. I feel as if I've certainly improved my knowledge in the last 45 minutes. So thanks again